I made the mistake of asking if I should have slides and was told that yes, I should have slides. So I'm going to be the odd man out in this panel, but I'll go through them quickly and I'll show you some pictures. I'd first actually like to thank Kaushik Basu for inviting me, and it's really a tremendous honor to be part of such a distinguished gathering, both on the podium and in the audience. So we're talking about the global slowdown and economic policy making in emerging economies. And what I first want to bring out is that this is an elastic concept. Emerging economies are very diverse. Here's one measure of that diversity. This is the responsiveness of the growth rate of an economy to a slowdown in European Union growth. And this is from HSBC. So these are not my numbers, and one can always massage numbers, but I think it's illustrative. So you can see, maybe you can see that I don't have a pointer, but way on the right you can see China and India, the two global giants among the emerging economies. You can also see differences overall between Latin America, China, and so on. On the left you have countries like Russia. So there's, we have to be careful when we're talking about emerging economies, and this is a theme I'll develop. Here we look at that diversity, adding another dimension, another one that I want to explore some more. And on the horizontal axis, you have, again, responsiveness, in this case, to slowdown in the US. On the vertical axis, you have policy flexibility. And this policy flexibility is an index reflecting fiscal deficits, debt, inflation, and so on. And you can see that way up on the top left hand is China, CN. So it's the most resilient emerging economy. India is not in the bottom right hand, but it's in the bottom left hand. So it's not very responsive to a slowdown in the US, but very little policy flexibility. So my point is that emerging economies are diverse. We have to pay attention to that. And yet there are patterns in exporters and service exporters. And this is very useful because, again, we shouldn't always lump emerging economies together. If I give you four major examples of these categories, of course, you have the four BRICS. So we're used to lumping the BRICS together, but actually they have very different economic structures, and their responses are going to be tempered by their structures. Now, the fiscal divide is very important, and there's two aspects of it. One is, if you look at these graphs, you can see the blue and red lines are emerging economies and low-income economies, and they took a little bit of a dip in their deficits, increase in their deficits, but their debt to GDP ratios haven't been too bad at all, and that's because of growth. But you can see a huge worsening of the situation in advanced economies, both in terms of deficit and debt, and this is something that will continue to constrain the advanced economies. Now, if you look at the major emerging economies, again, India is somewhat of an outlier, and I think this is one illustration of that policy inflexibility that I mentioned, I showed you earlier in an earlier graph. So I think India is a little bit in a harder position than some of the other emerging economies. This is IMF data. So back to what should we do? We should prepare for a longer run slowdown in the advanced economies. You heard that in the morning from Richard Freeman. Given the situation with respect to debt, both private sector and public sector, fiscal deficits, and demographics, and there's two aspects of this demographics. One is aging, and the other is the increased heterogeneity of Western societies, which is challenging their social contract, increased immigration from the developing countries. So we're going to see, I think, we're not going to see that same golden age of growth for the advanced economies. So what we have to do from an emerging economy perspective is we have to coordinate more. There have to be stronger global financial safety nets. If we are going to preserve financial openness, you have to have the safety nets. And again, you can see from what's happening in Europe that Europe alone is not able to take global leadership. It really, they're asking for money from China, and really the emerging economies are going to play a more and more important role in terms of maintaining financial stability. You have to maintain trade openness. Again, I think the emerging economies have to play a leadership role, and we have to stop thinking of ourselves as the sort of, the poor cousins, and really go into everything on an equal footing, and that's really what the G20 allows emerging economies to do. And this is a point that has come up in several presentations. Really, we have to work on maximizing the global value of intellectual capital. And that's really the source of all wealth is our human ingenuity. And that's really, this we could go into long detail about how to do this. But as a vision, as a policy goal, macro policy goal, I think that's absolutely crucial. So to conclude, the global slowdown may be structural, part of a longer-term shift in economic balance. So we have to accept that and work around that. In the short run, standard macroeconomic prescriptions apply. And as I noted, they're going to be tempered by initial conditions and structural differences. So each emerging economy is going to have to respond somewhat differently. And the emerging economies have to look more to themselves. They have to look inward to their own domestic economies and domestic reform, for example, and to each other. India, China, other emerging economies have to work more closely with each other and basically develop policies to foster economic interaction, innovation, and growth. And Professor Sen said, well, where are we going to emerge? Again, we can debate that, but certainly we have to finish emerging. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nirvikar, for a very succinct statement on the various factors that are present in the current world, and also indicating what we need to do in the short run and what we need to do in the long run. Finally, may I request Justice Justin Lin, who is the Chief Economist at the World Bank and Senior Vice President, Development Economics, to make his statement. Yes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just make 2 points. The first one, the global slowdown is likely to be protracted. And the second point, under the kind of situation, how emerging countries prepare for the worst. Regarding the global economies, certainly, currently, most attention is on the sovereign debt crisis in Eurozone. We know that there are only 2 possible outcomes. The first one, orderly restructuring of their debt. And the second one, disorderly restructuring of their debt. For the orderly restructuring, certainly the European Central Bank, Northern European countries, IMF and so on, need to come up with some kind of package to bail out Greece, Italy, Portugal, and other highly indebted countries. And also the bank in a Northern European country, which purchased the government bond of those countries, need to receive certain kind of haircuts. That means that Northern European country, Eurozone, need to pay some cost for that. And for the disorderly restructuring means that the highly indebted country default on their debt. Certainly, that will trigger some kind of global financial crisis. Country in European zone and other parts need to pay for the cost of that. And at the same time, if there's some kind of default, those banks in Northern European country, they are going to incur huge losses. And under the kind of situation, to prevent the collapse of those banks, Northern European country and also European Central Bank also need to help them to recapitalize. And that's going to be very costly. Compare these 2 scenarios, certainly orderly restructuring will be less costly for the Northern European country and also for the world. However, economic rationality is not enough because the challenges for the Northern European countries is how to explain to their domestic constituencies that it's good for them to pay the cost of this kind of package. Because domestic constituencies in Northern European countries, in general, they work harder, they pay higher tax compared to the highly indebted country, like in Greece, in Italy. They pay less tax, they did not work as hard, and under this kind of situation, it's very hard for politicians to explain to their constituency to pay the cost unless crisis really hit. So under that kind of situation, certainly we can only hope for the best. But I'd like to say, even there's some kind of orderly restructuring of the debt, it may not be enough. The reason is that although the crisis was triggered by financial crisis, but the roots of the problem now is in the real economy sectors. In the appearance, we see the debt, the high unemployment, but in the reality reflect there is a huge underutilization of the capacity in the real sectors, in the real economy. Because of that, certainly, you are going to have high unemployment. It's a reflection of that. And under this kind of situation, with large excess capacity in housing sector, in construction sector, in manufacturing sectors, it's very hard for the private sectors to find good investment opportunities. Even interest rate has been brought down to almost zero. If the private sectors do not have high incentive to make investment, at the same time with high unemployment rate, the consumption is also going to be very sluggish. And we know that in any economy, investment and consumption are the major chunks of the economy. It's both sectors, both areas have a very sluggish in their growth. The whole economy is going to be very sluggish. The growth will slow down. Government revenue will be reduced. But at the same time, unemployment is high. The social expenditure need to continue to increase. And the government debt will be accumulated. And that means that even you have orderly restructuring, without regenerate growth, the government debt will continue to accumulate. And this is a situation occurred in Japan since 1991. At that time, Japan's government debt as a percentage of GDP was only about 60%, among the lowest in the OECD country. And now it increased to about 220%. And if a country is not a globally accepted reserve currency country, like Japan or like the US, they can continue to print money to pay those kind of debt. If a country, even its currency is globally reserved, like Eurozone, but they don't have authority to print the money by themselves, then under that kind of situation, debt crisis will hit again. Is there a way out for this kind of dilemma? For this, I'd like to agree with Professor Amartya Sen this morning. He said, this growth mediation development. Currently, because of high government debt, many countries, many discussions focus on how to have a fiscal consolidation, how to have austerity programs. But this may not be a right prescription. Because if a government have a austerity, have a consolidation, the expenditure reduced, unemployment will rise, social expenditure will increase. But the government revenue will be reduced. And even with a good intention of reducing public debt, but in effect, public debt will continue to rise. Since that, no matter the government have an austerity or consolidation program or not, the public debt will continue to grow, it's better to think how to use the government expenditure in a better way in the short run, generate a demand, create a job, but in the long run can enhance productivity and growth. And so in the future, if the productivity increase, growth enhanced, the government revenue will also be increased. So in the medium and long run, the government revenue can be balanced. There's an area for that. I was invited by the India Development Bank to give its annual lecture in May 2009. At that time, I promote an idea called Young Keynesianism. That is, the government used the fiscal expenditure to make investment in areas which in the short run create jobs, generate demand, but in the long run promote growth and productivity in areas like the infrastructure, like the green economy and so on. If the government can do that, it will be a much better way. But I'd like to say, this is a global crisis. Although now the attention is on the high-income country, but even high-income country adopt this kind of program, it may not be enough, because you need to use this investment in areas which can enhance productivity and growth in the futures. In a high-income country, certainly there's some scope for improve their infrastructure, but overall, high-income countries' infrastructure in general are not so bad. So the scope for improvement is small. So under this kind of situation, it's very important to have a global initiative about investment cross borders. In the developing country, we know there are many infrastructure bottlenecks. And if we can make investment in those areas, although investment is in the developing country, but globally we are cross economy. They will also generate demand and job in a high-income country. For example, I understand India has a very ambitious infrastructure